It often seems to me, that 80% of the advice that people are given online when they're looking for advice on how to practice something is simply to slow it right down. Now, surely, if we always use the same approach, then doesn't that equate to putting all of our eggs in one basket? So in this video, I'd like to explore the risks of doing this all the time and also some ways that we might be able to shake things up a little. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists, or indeed anyone who loves piano, to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, then please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen now, and it's all done for you. There are many expressions, aren't there, that we use in everyday life, such as not putting all of your eggs into one basket, or maybe the importance of having more than one string to our bow. They all share one thing in common, and that's that it's generally agreed that it's a bad idea to always do things in exactly the same way, and we need to approach things from different angles if we want to give ourselves the best chance of success. However, very often it seems to me that with piano, people want to always push us down the same route. I'm an active member of some Facebook groups and I enjoy Reddit. And generally speaking here, you'll get 80% of the advice, it seems, is always just slow it down, slow it down, slow it down. Now, I'm not saying that per se this is bad advice, of course it's not. However, if it's the only strategy we ever try to adopt when learning new music, I don't think it's that good an idea, and it certainly is likely to halt our progress somewhat. After all, if it is a bad idea to put all of our eggs into one basket, then why wouldn't that apply to playing piano? I think there are three main reasons we do need to try and vary our approach to learning new music. And the first, of course, is that if we simply repeat something too often in exactly the same way, let's face it, our brain has a tendency to wander, doesn't it? And what can start off as quite mindful practice soon really just turns into note bashing. And whilst, yes, repetition might be the mother of all learning, I think that simply mindless repetition might not do us particularly any harm, but is it really doing us any good? The second thing I think is that it can be quite often difficult to work out what things are working well for us and what things aren't. Let's be honest, not everything works for every piece of music. Not every strategy works for every person. So if we can find 10 different ways of practicing something, then there's more likelihood within those 10 that 1, 2, 3 or more of them will actually be doing us lots of good rather than just marking time. And the third reason I think it pays to find different ways of practicing is that if we're repeating something constantly in the same way, yes, I've said already it's quite boring, but the other thing is it does put us at more risk of injury if we keep repeating the exact same movements in the same way for too long. Let me give an example of what I mean. I was recently learning Chopin's B Minor Waltz, and there's one section in the edition that I've got that has thirds and repeated chords in it. And this section is actually only 16 measures long out of the entire piece, but I bet I spent at least as much time on these 16 measures as I spent on the remainder. Now, of course, if I limit myself to simply repeating these bars slowly, then that means I'm relying on a single strategy to give me success. However, that said, if I simply carry on ploughing through them sloppily, then I'm actually likely to be making things worse rather than better. And therefore, we need to find different ways of approaching these things. So let's look closely at these 16 measures and see what we could do. The first thing we can do is we can split it into 4 parts. So we have measures 81 to 84, where it's basically major thirds against a B major scale in the right hand. We then have bars 85 to 88, where we have a set of repeated chords. Then in bars 89 to 92, we have the same double third idea, but this time against a B minor scale. And then finally, in measures 93 to 96, we have another set of repeated chords. However, even within these 4 sections, we can still break things down even further. We have, of course, my 4/4 waltz technique that I've spoken about before, where effectively we modify one of the beats in the bar from being a quarter note to a half note. So looking at just the opening part, we could play like this, which is half, quarter, quarter. We can play it like this, which is quarter, half, quarter. And then finally, we can play it like this, which is quarter, quarter, half. You could apply exactly the same principle to the rest of these measures as well, easily enough. Another good way of practicing, of course, is to use dotted rhythms. And here we get 2 different variants. We have a first, which is like this, and then a second, which sounds more like this. So if you think about it like this, we've now got 5 ways of practicing each of these individual little sections. And given we've got 4 sections here, that's 20 different exercises already available to us. And of course, if we then practice these both legato and staccato, that effectively doubles the number for us. Now, one thing that I found interesting, say with the 4/4 waltz technique, and I noticed this when I was learning Chopin C Minor Waltz, is that when we have the 3 different variants of 4/4, we might find that one or more of them is relatively easy for us to play, whereas another one might be much more difficult to control. For example, in the segments we've talked about already, the set of thirds, I found that the third variant, so the quarter, quarter, half, was for me quite easy to control, but the other 2 less so. Yet oddly, for the second segment, I found that half, quarter, quarter works much more easily than the other variants. This, I think, then gives us clues of where we might have a particularly tricky sequence of notes that we can break things down even further and focus just on those areas. So, for example, in the thirds bit, I practiced the last sequence of notes, which clearly is the bit that gives me the most trouble. Then another useful way of practicing thirds, and I got this from a Graham Fitch video, is to practice each element of the thirds. So you practice just the bottom note first, making sure that you voice that nice and softly. And then you practice separately with just the top note of the thirds. And again, these are all things that we can put into little exercises, loop through them a few times without looping too often that, again, our mind starts to disconnect from what we're doing. Next, we can start to add these segments together, and we might first do that using our 4/4 variant, so the 3 different ways of doing it. And if we want to really keep our brain from going onto autopilot, we could use a different variant for each segment. So we could do, for example, the first segment as quarter, quarter, half, and then the second segment as half, quarter, quarter. And of course, one of the advantages to gradually increasing the number of notes that we're going to play at any one time is that we increase our chances of being able to repeat these notes correctly. Of course, we do always need to remember that we need to also get into the habit of practicing things as written too, don't we? So then maybe as we feel our exercises are starting to work, we could just practice the first measure and a beat of the first segment. So we're practicing just those thirds together. Then before each repetition of this measure and a beat, let's take a conscious break, think about what went well or maybe what went not so well, and then repeat. It's then simply a matter of perhaps adding measure by measure until we've got the entire 4 measures that we're playing as written comfortably. Now what I've given you here is just an example, right? A random piece that I've used as an example. And the lengths we might need to go to doing this kind of thing will depend on the piece itself and on what we find difficult. In the example I've used, you might find that for you, simply a few slow repetitions of this section is enough to get it under your fingers and you're fine. However, I found it more tricky, so I had to work a little bit more on it. As an aside, strangely, my 20-year-old self would have probably thought, who cares, nobody will probably notice anyway if it sounds a bit on the sloppy side. But these days, I try to set slightly a higher bar for myself and try to get things as good as I can at the point I'm learning them. And I think as long as we're not simply repeating the same action and hoping that we're going to get a different result, which, as my old boss used to say, was Einstein's definition of insanity, then if we can find different ways of practicing, it can only be a good way for us to work. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.